Good morning, and thank you, Catherine, for the introduction. Good morning to everyone. It was a pleasure to see many of you in person yesterday. Unfortunately, I had to do my presentation this morning virtually since there is a big announcement on a new highway, and I'll be joining the Premier and our Minister of Transport this morning for that announcement. And it's part of the reason why I'm doing the lightning talk this morning, is to talk about infrastructure and talk about some of the things that LiUNA is doing. So we are the largest construction union in Canada with approximately 150,000 members in the construction industry. And through the pandemic, as many of you know, numerous sectors in the economy were affected negatively. In fact, I think that it was one of the worst pandemics in a century, and probably the worst economic contraction since 1945 after the Second World War. But the construction industry, which is made up anywhere between 1.5 and 2 million workers across the country, continued to work. We were deemed essential. And so our members worked right throughout the pandemic. Many of you run into them all the time, and please don't curse them when they're doing road work and blocking lanes and everything else. It shows that the economy is moving, and it shows that the construction industry that makes up such a very large part of our economy with a GDP of 8 to 10%, it's important to keep our folks working. Throughout 2020, during the pandemic, we saw a decline. Even though many of our members were working, we saw a decline of about 3.4%. But this year, in 2021, we saw an increase of 6.1%, quite a dramatic turnaround. And it shows you that we are on the road to recovery. This recovery and all the work that's out there has been creating some skill shortages, and that would be a talk for another time. But it's an important topic, and numerous actions are being taken in order to ensure that we have a very strong and productive workforce for the years to come, since there will be so much work. So I wanted to touch upon infrastructure in particular, because we're going to see a number of governments, whether the municipal or provincial or federal governments, spending quite a few dollars on infrastructure. And I have to tell you that one of the reasons I wanted to highlight that this morning is because we've had an enormous infrastructure deficit in Canada for many, many years. And we're not going to catch up just because we're going to try to spend our way out of a pandemic and create recovery. Infrastructure needs to be planned over a number of years. Many of you that are there live this morning drove on the Gardiner Expressway. I mean, the Gardiner Expressway was built in 1963. Not exactly a new road. And in fact, a very bumpy road, one that's been fixed and patched up over several decades. So, we really need to pump up our investments in infrastructure right across the country. And in fact, looking at a study that was done by McGill University, back in 1985, we had an infrastructure deficit of $12 billion. By 2007, we were at almost $200 billion in infrastructure deficit. Now, that was a study done by McGill, and they have not updated it since. But imagine in 2007, we were $200 billion infrastructure deficit in the country. And what that means is that it would take, in 2007, $200 billion to fix our transportation infrastructure, social infrastructure, a number of other projects are across the country in order to get back to some level of normality when it comes to infrastructure. So imagine if it was 200 billion in 2007, where we are today. And so I like to compare projects around the world and what they're doing in different countries in order to show the differences in what we're doing here in Canada. And in fact, just lately, many of you know that we've had some fairly significant announcements by the provincial and federal governments with regards to transportation infrastructure, in particular, the subway systems in Toronto, subway lines in Toronto. But let's use the subways as a perfect example. The metro in Paris was started in 1900. It has 700 trains that run, and it runs on a track of 225 kilometers. The tube in London, which was started even earlier in 1863, runs on a line of 402 kilometers. Now, if you compare that with a modern city like Toronto, we should have even more than that, but we don't. We only have a few lines here and there. And that's because we've got an infrastructure deficit where governments, whether they be municipal, provincial, or federal, in order to balance their budgets, the very first thing that they have done is cut large projects out of their budget in order to balance their budgets. You know, you can only do that for so long because, as many of you know, you drive on the roads and there are potholes. There are bridges that have collapsed in Quebec and in a number of other jurisdictions right across North America, actually. And so we're reaching a critical point where infrastructure needs to be rehabilitated. So what are we doing? What is LiUNA doing in order to address this infrastructure deficit? So our pension plan, which is the largest multi-employer pension plan in Canada, that now has in excess of $10 billion in assets, we've invested in infrastructure, amongst other things, 15% in real estate and development, and 8 to 9% in infrastructure. We've invested in numerous projects, numerous P3s right across the country, and also in the United States. And in fact, investing in these projects, we've leveraged in 2019 and in 2020, we leveraged about $8 billion worth of construction that we invested in. So we invested in a number of residential projects, some warehousing as well, industrial warehousing, like, for instance, the large distribution center for Walmart in Vaughan, which is one of our investments as well. But also in the United States, the Virgin Hotel, which we are the major shareholder in Las Vegas, the $2 billion Los Angeles Airport, LAX's parking garage, the Prince George School project in the United States. That's a $1.2 billion project. And so, you know, we need to have the private sector investing also in infrastructure, because we can't just depend on the public purse in order to catch up for all the years of infrastructure deficits that, quite frankly, and projects that have been ignored. So we're doing it. But I wanted to leave you with this thought, that if, in fact, LiUNA is investing 8% of our funds in infrastructure, if you take the total amount of funds that pension plans have in assets in Canada, which add up to $2.25 trillion, 8% of that, if my math is correct, is $180 billion. And if you put that on top of what the public entities, federal government, provincial government, and municipal governments are investing in infrastructure, I imagine that if we could get private investments from our pension plans, I'm sure that we could reach a point where we could wipe out that deficit and have a better infrastructure throughout the country, not just for us, but also for our children. That's it for me. Great to be with all of you here this morning. Have a great conference. Thank you.